We're pleased to have on the program now the Poet Laureate of San Francisco, Jack Hirschman. Thank you for being with us.
Yeah, lovely to be here.
So far, are you enjoying this experience?
Well, yes. The kind of power that comes with image in this is not something that I particularly like, but because I'm most powerful when I'm in the act of writing a poem. But nonetheless, it's a very interesting experience.
What's happened since you've been named? Do you have to do any special appearances, or do you have any special responsibilities?
Well, groups have particularly asked me to be present because they're pleased. I mean, because the giving of the endowment of the Poet Laureateship is not merely just a victory for me, but because of some of the things that I stand for and which many people identify with. So it's their victory, and so they want me also to appear. So I've appeared for events for the living wage, against the School of the Americas, that school in Fort Benning, Georgia, which trains Latinos largely to go back to their countries and perform torture and repression of the people in those countries.
I would hope, though, in Latin America right now, with the 5 or 6 new presidents, like Chavez and so on, that they're not taking advantage of.
Well, yeah, that's very good. You're correct. Venezuela has now refused to send their people in the army, that's basically the art, to Fort Benning, Georgia, and the hope is that other countries will follow that. So that's been another event for African American History Month.
And the war.
And the war. Yes, I'll be reading at the March 18th demonstration, and also there's an event on the 19th for immigration rights.
It's an amazing, you know, I remember one line from something I've read so much about you in preparing for the program, and also, and it's been an adventure. You said that really one of the great commitments you have is to beauty.
Yes.
And yet you're also very committed to social protest and for a better life. How do you combine those two?
Well, I came up and began to write in my teens in a period where language was very essential in the making of a poem. The sibilance of language, the melodiousness of language. And there were many American poets that were early influential on that, and there were also European poets that came over in great waves of translation. And I'm speaking of the late 40s and early 50s in the States here. That gave me a sense of the sound of language. And for the first 20 years of my life, when I was really trying to be equal to my peers, my contemporaries, that was really an essential part. It still is, but the opening out of my more social and political life as a poet I've been able to bring language to that, so to bring the elements of sibilance to that, so that it's not just simply repertorial.
Or propaganda.
Well, I don't have, as I mentioned last evening at an event, I don't have the negative association with the word propaganda. I believe all poetry is propaganda.
Okay.
For one or another reason, a love poem is a propaganda for love. and I don't. It's often used in a capitalist society. Propaganda is used in a very negative way, but I don't feel that way. And I've done a lot of propaganda in my life too.
But so your poetry is really directed. It's directed outwards. It's not directed just to some internal inner workings or your own inner perceptions. You're involved with the world. You're concerned. We'll get into that in a moment. Very concerned about the world. And your poetry, which came first in your mind? Do you think the poetry came first and then the opening up, or was it your political commitments to social revolution?
Well, that's of course difficult to say. I'm now 72 years old, and I've been writing since I was, say, 17, though earlier. I wrote my first poem was a poem that was a song poem to celebrate the victory over fascism in the Second World War, which I sang at a block party that my father sort of organized, and it was a poem which was like "Ring, ring, ring the bells of freedom." That was the title, and it was a poem of victory in that way. So right there was even a political dimension that took place. But I went through various stages of academic life, and then came into the street, so to speak, in San Francisco in late 72, and I've never left that.
Were you interacting with the so-called beat poets of the 50s?
Well, of course, I'd been a friend of, when I was a university professor, I was a friend of Allen, who was, so to speak, in the street then.
Sure.
Allen Ginsberg, and also because I translated with a man named Victor Ehrlich a book of Mayakovsky's poetry, the great Russian poet, the first street poet of the 20th century, and the one who embraced the Bolshevik Revolution. And Allen really modeled a lot of his work on Mayakovsky and William Blake.
When you say how do you define a street poet?
Well, I mean a street poet in the sense of someone who is not in the academic world. San Francisco has had many street poets. Some of them are confused with beat. San Francisco has had many, and they have many now. Bob Kaufman was a street poet. Jack Micheline was a street poet. A.D. Winans today is a street poet. These are folks who really relate. For most instances, there's a dimension of the anarchism which exists really in any poetry, but they relate also to a sense of what the workers are going through and what the working class is going through. And today, the street poets, there are many, because what has been created in the last 20 years is with the step of robotization, or we're creating a new class of people, new class of poor people in the world is being created, and out of there are coming poets and voices. Some of the hip-hop dimension comes out of that too, is expressive of that. Though the hip-hop has moved almost purely into an orality, so their books you find in their discs rather than the books. But they have nonetheless brought a certain dimension of revolt and resistance to the system, to capitalism, in their intricate rhyming works.
Do you think your poetry is more of a written poetry than an oral poetry?
Well, it's both. For my generation, the book is essential and will always be for me. Therefore, the page is essential. But the page is, as it were, a score to be sounded. In the deepest kind of way, I make a reference to the journal between the ears. I've lived that way in San Francisco almost really all my life here, because I've sounded poems in cafes, in the daily life of my engagement with people, as well as in demonstrations, etc.
I have to ask you about, you're a Marxist or a communist. Probably a Marxist would be a better, and this is something you have not lost any zeal or conviction for.
But Marx is a philosopher who has also happened to have been an activist. The difference between Marxists and peripatetic philosophers is that Marx, Lenin, they didn't only write about politics. They wrote about many things, but biological and cultural things.
You do hold out hope, and certainly an intention that wealth be redistributed.
Absolutely.
I mean, that is. Let's just get past Marx. Just say that.
That's absolutely, and that has to do really with just the commonsensical things of. I've even written a poem on that called "Common Sense," which was taken, from Thomas Paine's great writer. Perhaps the greatest revolutionary, the American Revolution, was Thomas Paine.
When you look at China with their rush towards commercialism and so on, what do you make of that? Where that was one of the great revolutions of the communist era?
Well, You understand, everything has been pushed forward by the development, intensification of technology. I believe that technology is in the control of the world, and that's one of the reasons people are also so confused, because none of us really know how ultimately to deal with it, not even the people who own the means of the technology, or production of technology itself. And so China obviously has been interested in also technological development. China also is very interested in maintaining as much as possible the infrastructure wherein people can get a bit of food, have a place to live, have a relatively free education, and a redistribution of the wealth. And of course that will change, go through changes, because as China brings in more development from capitalist countries, I mean, I know people who've been factory owners in China for 25 years. It's not been anything new. It opened up when Nixon and Mao got together. That's a long process. But China one must always remember that China is very conscious of the fact it has 1 billion people, and it wants to be able to maintain that 1 billion people with a certain degree of human dignity. It doesn't want the vast polarity that exists, for example, in a country like ours, where poverty exists, but at a level of such squalidness amidst a highly drugged, because people are in pain. That's why people take drugs, because they're in pain. So you have a different dimension. China certainly doesn't want the reappearance of the opium dimension that occurred before the communist revolution.
I want to, we have a couple of minutes left. You have a special commitment to the homeless in San Francisco. How do you think the state is, state of the city right now?
I think that the mayor has done some things for a particular segment of the homeless population. Obviously, homelessness is widespread, and the poem that I'll read,
and we want you to do it very soon.
Yes, will be an expression of, because I think, because I truly believe that you can never, unless you distribute the wealth of the country, you will never be able to have an end to homelessness.
Supportive housing is just that.
Yes, and to perhaps the most obscene thing I've heard recently, and I've written about it already in other places, is when the week that the schools closed in San Francisco, Exxon announced that it had $36 billion in profit.
I want you to read your poem.
Yeah. This is called Weapon of Mass Destruction. For almost 20 years, these streets have been home to the victims, and there have been more each year, of the horrible use of the weapon of mass destruction that has grown more evil each succeeding year. Surely you know it. Look at the sidewalk and the ravaged body on it. Look in the doorway where your brother and sister is curled up in pain. How many God bless yous have followed you home? How many thank yous? You're a veteran of all this by now. You're a street person who's seen so many disappeared, murdered, murdering each other. Silence, the great silence of shame under all words, all noises, turns in on itself, is itself lost, no longer get-at-able, might as well be dead. Who has lived knowing the weapon of mass destruction intimately, precisely as the dirty tip of a boot that looks you in the eye when you wake in the morning in some shelter anywhere you can get to. O weapon of mass destruction, we've inspected you all our lives and find you everywhere, capitalism, and want you irrevocably dead.
Jack Hirschman, thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
And stay with us. We'll be right back.